Right now we have 10 participants. Thank you for everyone to come. And Pani Oksana, that's
Do you want me to introduce myself
yes.
or? Okay. My name is Oksana Piasecki, and I'm a member of the U.S. Committee for Ukrainian Genocide Awareness. It's a group of people all over the United States that are interested in the issues of the Holodomor. And I've been kindly asked by Olenka to present a lesson to you today because the original presenter unfortunately had an accident and couldn't be here. So my best wishes to her. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to tell you a story that has been unknown by most people and covered up for generations. The story is about Holodomor, a devastating famine of such scope that has no comparison, which the word itself translates into to kill by hunger. This story takes place in Ukraine during the time of the Soviet Union Empire, when most of Ukraine was forced into the Union of Soviet Republics. Ukraine is a country that is larger than France and bordered by Poland to the west, Belarus to the north, Russia to the west, and Romania and Moldavia to the south. You can see on the left-hand side map how big Ukraine actually is in comparison to the other countries that surround it. This map shows you in the dark color what part of Ukraine was actually affected by the Holodomor, the famine. So it was a major portion, and it was in the eastern part of Ukraine. And you see the Kuban area to your west. Ukraine was considered for hundreds of years by the world as the breadbasket of Europe, feeding people throughout Europe with such a rich black soil and harvesting plentiful wheat. How was it that such a bountiful country found itself in 1932 and 33 not able to feed its own people? The story goes back to Joseph Stalin, the ruler of the Soviet Empire, who envisioned his empire with subjugated peoples, who would strictly comply with his rules and regulations and become one Russian people. He had 16 republics, all of which had their own identity, culture, and language. But Stalin wanted a homogenized society where only Russian would be spoken and only Russified culture would be tolerated. He discovered that the Ukrainians were not as easy to control as other peoples and other republics. So he had to use his harshest methods to achieve success in Ukraine. To subjugate Ukraine, Stalin had to wipe out the identity of this nation. The Ukrainians, with their spirit of freedom, fought against any subjugation. They demonstrated and rebelled against any enforcement of limited rights and forced Russification. So Stalin took a four-pronged approach to destroy the Ukrainian nation. He first would attack the brain of the nation by killing its writers, educators, artists, and leaders. Then he would go for the soul of the people, which was in eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. He murdered the clergy and destroyed the churches. Thirdly, in his plan were the farmers, who were the repository of traditions, folklore, and music. And then finally, in his plan, he would resettle the area that he had murdered, and he would put in Red Army veterans and loyalists with their families into that area. 80% of the intelligentsia was executed, and the spirit of individualism and independence that the Ukrainians felt had to disappear. Stalin implemented his 5-year plan, his first one from 1928 to 1933. And in this plan, his collectivization program was primary. He forced all the small farmers, which were called in Ukrainian kurkuls, who lived off their own farms. Now they had to group together into what was called a kolkhoz, or state-run farms. Everything had to be produced not for themselves, but for the state, with very little being left for the farmers for their own existence. Stalin imposed very high grain quotas. If you could not meet them, then you were sent off to Siberia. And then even more impossible quotas were established. And since Stalin was getting impatient and saw that the farmers were not eager to participate, he decided to impose harsher punishments, which led to the Holodomor. The punishments were very extreme. First, you remove any of the cows, chickens, or goats that the farmer might have, and you take them to the collective cage centers where they were actually left to die because no one was really taking care of them. And then Stalin sent his henchmen, his militia, to remove any bit, any grain of food that you had in your house. And if you had it buried, then the occupants would be shot on the spot. He signed into law in 1932 a law which is known as the 5 Ears of Corn Law. If you were found with 5 grains of wheat, you would be either shot or given 10 years in a concentration camp for stealing socialist property. It didn't belong to you, it belonged to the state. And this was not anything, there was nothing that you could have as far as food is concerned that they would not destroy. So in these circumstances, people would be picking up leaves, twigs, bark, and making soup out of that. And of course, how long would that keep you living? All the borders were closed to the country of Ukraine. The starving people could not go out from the villages without permission from the village official. So it was impossible for them to go even sometimes into the cities, but not out of the border of Ukraine. The people were desperate. And you see in this photo, the bodies that are on the ground that have died of hunger, and they are being prepared to be thrown into a mass grave. And to the right, you see a little girl, and you see how emaciated she is, and the children above. And these were the children that were walking through the streets, trying to get food from anyone. Another way that these people were exploited by the Soviet state was by state-run stores. They actually served as pawn shops, which are called torksin. And these stores were established before the years of the Holodomor as speculative enterprises, taking advantage of the poor and suffering. And the state would basically steal your valuables by offering to exchange them for bits of food. They collected gold, silver, diamonds, platinum that people had treasured throughout the years, or artworks, such as the icons, the religious pictures that they had on their walls. In this way, the state removed all the valuables from desperate people and later sold them for enormous amounts to foreigners for foreign currency, depleting valuables from Ukraine that would not be discovered until later on in recent times. Everyone is dying from hunger, No relief is allowed. In these articles that were allowed to be printed during that time, you see other photos of how the misery was in Ukraine. During this time, grain is being exported worldwide, and other parts of the Soviet Union are not enduring this hunger. It is only in Ukraine. If you just consider the amount or the number of people that were dying during one day, it's unfathomable. 17 per minute, 1,000 per hour, 25,000 per day. We come to the big lie and how it affected the events and why the lie. Walter Duranty was a British citizen and engaged by the New York Times to be its Moscow correspondent. Duranty would be the most influential journalist to spread the big lie that led to 7 to 10 million people starving, and the world allowed this genocide to occur. In the 30s, communism was thought to be a utopian answer to the world's problems of economic depression. Many were committed communists who wanted Stalin's experiment to succeed. So keep anything negative out of the news. And Duranty, of course, played into this picture very well. He was one of a group of journalists in Moscow who rallied around Stalin and were favorably rewarded with lavish lifestyles, while others were barely living under primitive conditions. And the journalists had to obey the orders given to them by the Soviet rulers and to stay in the cities assigned and not venture into the countryside. The journalists had to write lies if they wanted to retain their status of living in Moscow. Life for everyone except the privileged in the 1930s was one of survival. Food was sporadic. Factories were not even producing the basics, not even a decent pair of shoes. Some people were walking around with shoes that had holes in them. Since the system that Stalin envisioned was not performing to expectations. People working in factories were not producing since they were paid very meager salaries, which only sustained them with bare necessities. There was no incentive under this system. Most communists, however, were not disenchanted, but thought that you had to suffer a little in order to build a paradise for the future. And Duranty loved to use this phrase, "You cannot make an omelet without breaking a few eggs." To ingratiate himself with Joseph Stalin, Duranty wrote very complimentary reports on Stalin's collectivization plans. Stalin invited him for an interview, and as a result, Duranty had special privileges. For the New York Times, this was exactly what was needed to spread the good news about communism that so many wanted to hear. This also played into the politics of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who wanted a better relationship with Stalin so that it would help his economic situation in the United States, where we had a depression. He would buy grain from Stalin and send him machinery for his factories. Roosevelt met with Duranty and was given very positive feedback from him. Duranty told him that although there was some speculation of a famine in Ukraine, that this was out of proportion, and that people may be hungry in places, but definitely there is no famine. And this is what Duranty wrote for the New York Times for the world to read. While he was spreading this lie, millions were starving to death. What is really so despicable about Duranty is that he did know the truth, since he said in private that probably as many as 10 million perished in the famine. We call this a smoking gun, the Kleefeld Memorandum. It is proof that Durante wrote his dispatches according to Stalin's wishes. Durante said to a diplomat that he met in the embassy, the American embassy in Germany, and quoting Kleefeld in this memorandum, he says, Durante pointed out that in agreement with the New York Times and the Soviet authorities, his official dispatches always reflect the official opinion of the Soviet regime and not his own. The world listened to Durante because politically it was expedient. As a result, Walter Durante's big lie, Joseph Stalin, the murder of millions of people, was allowed to enter the League of Nations, and his Soviet Union was recognized by the US Congress. He became a big player in world politics. There were some reports of starvation and famine that came out because some brave journalists who wrote of the real conditions and said that there was a raging famine in Ukraine. Although they were denied to go into the villages, some bravely did so secretly, such as Gareth Jones, Jeffrey Lyons, and Malcolm Muggeridge. Others, like Henry Chamberlain, also believed their reporting and also wrote about the famine. They wrote to various periodicals about this horror, but Walter Durante quickly derided their stories as fabrications and not based on reality. Malcolm Muggeridge, the British journalist, said, quote, that the famine was one of the most monstrous crimes in history, so terrible that people in the future will scarcely be able to believe that it happened and that Walter Durante was the biggest liar that he had ever met. Some quotes from Gareth Jones, who wrote in his notebooks with the immediate impressions that he had when he went through the villages. I walked through the villages and 12 collective farms. Everywhere there was a cry, there is no bread, we are dying. Bread is the substance of life and such a big part of Ukrainians' traditions that without it, or the ability to make it, really brings death. And as the truthful reporter, Gareth Jones received no acclaim, but was ridiculed. He was considered dangerous because of his integrity and honesty. Agnieszka Holland, the most famous film director in Poland, she's considered equal to Steven Spielberg here in the United States, with the Ukrainian scriptwriter, Andrea Chalupa, created an outstanding film which came out last year called Mr. Jones. It is the story of the brave Gareth Jones. Miss Holland decided to make this film since she was so moved by the script and said, quote, there is something incredibly unjust in the fact that Stalin's crimes did not enter the consciousness as did the crimes of the Nazis. Most people have heard of the Holocaust, but not the Holodomor. And she believed that the story had to be told. In a movie review by Georgi Kent, he writes, Moscow's attempts to hide the truth about the famine in Ukraine must rank among the most successful examples of fake news in modern history. Ukrainians have been fighting for almost a century to tell the world about Stalin's famine. The act that a crime of such staggering proportions remains so relatively unknown is a testament to the enduring power of Soviet censorship and Kremlin disinformation. We can add to this also the complicity of the world in ignoring this horror. I would recommend this film highly to you. You can find it today streaming on Amazon. Walter Duranty was awarded for his fake news the coveted Pulitzer Prize in 1932 for his supposedly outstanding and honorable journalistic reporting on Stalin's collectivization plans. For many years, the Ukrainian diaspora has asked the Pulitzer Committee to revoke that prize. And the most significant effort in recent times was in 2003. And this was an enormous effort that was done by various organizations and engaged a historian from Columbia University, Professor Carl von Hagen, to do a serious analysis of Duranty's writings. He came to the conclusion that Duranty was undeserving of a prize based on the highest standards of scholarship. The Pulitzer considered all these arguments and responded, quote, "There is no clear and convincing evidence of deliberate deception. We know, based on the Qliphoth Memorandum, that the Pulitzer's conclusion was inaccurate." In addition, many journalists have pointed out that Duranty's writings were of very poor quality, non-deserving of the prize, and questioned the reason why it has not been revoked. The US Committee on Ukrainian Holodomor Genocide Awareness continues pursuing this revocation, which seems hopeless at times, but shaming the Pulitzer Committee to finally do the right thing seems the right honorable goal. The cover-up, the denials, and the dismissals. There are numerous reasons that help explain the lack of awareness by the public of the Holodomor and why this genocidal famine remained relatively unknown and unacknowledged until the late 1980s. Reasons being, the Soviets covered up the truth and would send you to Siberia or execute you for even mentioning the word famine. All documentation was hidden. It was only in 1980s, with some thaw in the Soviet Union, that information was coming out, and with the works of scholars like Robert Conquest and James Mace, more information was given to the public to the West. The Western press covered it up, the famine, the Holodomor, because it was expedient for political reasons that I mentioned before. And the indifference shown by the Western governments was for the promotion of the communist ideal and for the economic purposes. Western historians and intellectuals at the time were mesmerized by the communist propaganda and wanted to support it. Whether the Holodomor was a genocide has been debated since Raphael Lemkin in the late 40s introduced the concept of what a genocide is to the United Nations. And interestingly enough, he used the Ukrainian famine as the most obvious example of genocide. But because the Russians, the Soviets, did not want to admit until today that such a massacre occurred, there are those who still today do not accept this fact. They often claim that the hunger was widespread throughout the Soviet Empire. It wasn't just Ukraine. Yes, there were difficult conditions throughout the Soviet Empire, but only in Ukraine was there total devastation, an artificial famine, because this was part of Stalin's plan to bring Ukraine's resistance to its knees. The lies and truth in journalism have relevance to journalism today, and it's important to point it out. Our country stands for democracy, accountability, and truth. Journalists should always report the truth about a difficult situation. However, some choose to ignore the truth to benefit their personal comfort and position, as Walter Duranty did. Of course, there are always dangers, as journalists throughout the world have suffered death, car accidents, harassment for writing against their government's wishes. Some are truly heroes. It takes great courage to seek the truth through the journalist's own efforts instead of taking official statements as gospel and not going any further. Lies do affect world events. If there were a reaction to the Holodomor, perhaps the Holocaust would not have occurred. The Holodomor was committed with complete immunity. No communist leader has ever been brought to justice. Nazi leaders were punished for their crimes against humanity. The Soviet Union has lasted for 70 years and affected more people than Nazi rule. Today, Ukraine continues to suffer from Russian imperial ambitions. Putin took the Crimean Peninsula with force and claims it belongs to Russia. The Donbass area where Putin invaded Ukraine, the war is raging for 7 years, and it's another attempt by Putin to take over Ukraine. After killing millions of Ukrainians by hunger in eastern Ukraine, Stalin shrewdly repopulated the area at Soviet government expense with non-Ukrainian soldiers and their families. And these new farmers were provided housing, mechanized farm machinery, tools, household goods, and livestock. And they had no affinity for Ukrainian identity. Because of this, the area under siege today has many who lean toward Moscow. Out of the 195 countries of the world, 16 United Nations countries and Vatican City recognize the Holodomor as a genocide on the state level. 39 countries recognize the Holodomor, but not specifically that it was a genocide. The US has created a resolution recognizing that the Holodomor is a genocide, but has not put it into law. So it is a non-binding resolution. How long will it take for the US to do the right thing? I hope that the lesson on the Holodomor has piqued your interest and that you will go into this EduPath.org site where you can find a lot of information on how you can teach your classes about the Holodomor and materials. So I urge you to take the time and look into this website. I'd like to thank the Ukrainian American Holodomor Genocide Committee of Michigan, the Ukrainian National Women's League of America, the Michigan chapter, the Ukrainian American Civics Committee of Metropolitan Detroit, and the US Committee for Ukrainian Holodomor Genocide Awareness, who helped to put this program together. In Washington, DC, we have a memorial that was established 5 years ago for the victims of the Holodomor. And it took many years of efforts to get the permission to finally get it done. And in Kyiv, in the capital of Ukraine, there is a major museum dedicated to the victims and holds copious reference materials. The statue of the girl that you see to your right is in front of the museum as you go through the pathway to the entrance. The candle that you see there burning, it is part of a commemoration that we have the last Saturday in November, when we, throughout the world, light a candle in our window and join with everyone to commemorate the victims. I thank you so much for this opportunity to tell you about the Holodomor. And if you have any questions, I would be very happy to answer them.
Thank you for excellent presentation. And again, we are open. Oh, can you please show the web link again, or can someone add it to the chat? So for web link to EduPath.
Is this a free open education resource?
Yes, that's a free open education resource, and also those classes have been completed according Arc of Inquiry, C3 studies, civic studies for state Michigan. And you have to just register, and it's open. It's open source resources for teachers, and it's adapted for schools from 4th to 8th grade. And this book, it's Canadian book, but it's very useful for teaching Holodomor. We have, it's great developed, and it's a lot of information inside in that book. And we used this book also of materials to provide. But under EduPath, you will find material lessons, like 4 units describing Holodomor, PowerPoint presentation, and also multiple resources and links, useful ones.
I looked for the film, and I posted it on my LinkedIn account. I made a copy of the movie poster and posted it on my LinkedIn account. My son is a filmmaker, and he participated in making a second film on the hiding place. And so we watch a lot of films. So I plan on checking this one out for sure.
Thank you.
It has received very good reviews by many of those who review for various periodicals. It's really well worth it, and it gives you the true story of Gareth Jones, who really should have received the Pulitzer Prize and not Durante. And interestingly enough, when he went back a couple years later, and he was on a train going through Japanese-held China, he was actually murdered. And the rumors are that it was probably done by the NKVD, because
And by whom?
By the NKVD, which is the KGB,
Okay.
another name depending on when they were in power, because his driver who went with him was Russian.
Hmm.
So just an interesting side note to Gareth Jones. And there are quite a number of books that have been written by Gareth Jones. One is by Ray Gamache, which details a lot of what he had written in his notebooks, and is quite an interesting book to read, among others.
I was going to say, earlier when I was listening to talking about this, I was wondering if you were going to bring up the movie Mr. Jones.
Did you see it?
I've seen it, yes.
What did you think of it?
I quite liked it. I both, in the little bit of research I've done beside it, it seemed that it matched up with the historical record quite well. And also, I thought it was a very good dramatization of the themes. I'd recommend the movie.
Thank you for saying that. Appreciate it.
You know, and the thing is, there's so many cries of against the press these days, saying that this is fake news. This is fake news, and it's not. And suddenly we're finding the media, especially through social media, being corrupted by people who just lie. And it's astounding the story got out at all, given the time, because there was no such thing as the internet. And so it's really fascinating to me. I don't know very much about it, but I'm certain that I want to share the EduPaths with my high school teachers and give them the opportunity to explore this resource, especially since it is free. And will this PowerPoint be available to us?
Olenka?
Yes, yes, I will make it available. I will send it to our organizers. Yes. Or
Okay.
and I could provide my email, and everyone who wants it, I could forward this information.
Um, where we signed up for the course, I'm going to go ahead and type my email in the survey link. So
And I
thank
will-
you very much. And do you guys go into schools at all or do presentations around the state with ISDs and things?
We started to go to the schools like a Holocaust Museum, Armenian church, but for state, we had this in the plans to develop, to have printouts and also have like some kind of those lessons plans printed out too. But coronavirus happened to be so
Yeah,
right now. But we were lucky that we were able to create this course and aligned it with C3 curriculum studies for EduPath, and it was posted on EduPath. It was verified, all information was checked, so that's credible material to provide for teachers and safe for kids.
that's great. Now, what grade spans are they for? Is it just for high school or is it for middle school and high school?
You could start from grade 4, but you have to limit some information from grade 4.
Yeah, I would think so.
For grade 4, we're just giving very briefly explaining why that happens and commemoration. But also we presented it last year in our Ukrainian school, and kids didn't know about it. So they went home for their parents, and we distributed candles. It was for November, end of November. And parents later were writing for me letters, thank you letters, that kids were able to explain what happened. They didn't realize that such a horror could happen for people and why those people were dying. So they were asking questions. So that had effect on them, and they understood well.
And I just have another question. Is Crimea a part of Ukraine?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is, but it was taken by Putin because he decided it was his. So,
Well,
Putin does what he wants.
And before it was populated by Crimean Tatars, but they were resettled when Crimea was joined to Ukraine, and when Ukraine started to be independent, we invite Tatars back. So they were coming back, but right now they're expelled again. So
this land's been battled over for centuries because Russia wants a warm water port. And we get the Charge of the Light Brigade in that poem that was written about the war there in Crimea, and so the conflicts continue. Does Putin put any? Does the Russian party put any credence to the Communist Party? Put any credence to this terrible thing in history?
Can you explain which terrible thing in history?
The Holodomor.
Oh, the Holodomor? No,
Yeah.
it does not admit at all that this took place. It denies it because it says their whole point of view is that it was difficult. They were going through these changes, and there was hunger throughout the Soviet Union, and some people died. But it was not really any particular kind of an artificial famine. Stalin did not have that kind of a plan. they just lie through and through about this. So the only way you get the truth is by reading the actual historians' accounts, and we have a lot of data that has come out, and so there's lots of information. But the Soviets, the Russians today, they will say the same thing. Well, it never happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
A question that I have. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're quite all right, Sean.
One of the things that I find when studying totalitarian regimes, and this is, I find obviously there's more information that's generally made commonly available about things like the Holocaust, is the kind of, I think the term that is usually used is the banality of evil, the kind of the way in which this isn't something, in movies, this is often like this major event that's kind of this sudden thing, but instead it's this day-to-day misery that is massive in scale, and it's hard to convey that evil isn't the guy twirling the mustache with the monocle in the movie. There's a banality to this, that these people who are either rationalizing to themselves why they're doing this or just going along with it just passively. Is there any resources that you know of that communicate the kind of day-to-day development of this and the kind of more on-the-ground experience of it?
There is, day-to-day experience. I guess you have to take bits and pieces from various authors like Gareth Jones and his notebook. But also there was a very interesting book that came out recently. This is the story of Mendel Osherovich. And he is a Ukrainian, or he was, because he's dead at this point. He was a Ukrainian Jew that left Ukraine, came to the United States, and then wanted to visit his family in 1932. So he went and he visited various cities like Moscow, Odessa, and his family members, and he looked into their lives and everything in general. And he was amazed and appalled at what was going on. In his own particular family, there were members who belonged to the communists and those who did not. So he got interpretations from various people. And when he came back, he wrote this book, and he wrote it in Yiddish. It was never translated into English until last year, when a Ukrainian scholar found it and said, "Oh my God, this is a story of Holodomor. I have to get it translated." And he got it translated. And I'll tell you what the name of it is. It's How People Live in Russia, in Soviet Russia, Impressions from a Journey. And why he calls it Russia is because in Soviet Union, it was interchangeable. Whether it was Ukraine, it was Russia, that's what they called. But it's an amazing book that just came out, and it tells daily life and what he saw.
What was the subtitle?
It's called How People Live in Soviet Russia, Impressions from a Journey.
Okay.
And you can get this, there are very limited copies left, but you can get it at the University of Toronto Chair of Ukrainian Studies. If you would like, I can send you the information where you can receive.
Okay.
But it's fabulous. It's a fabulous book.
This has just been a phenomenal session tonight. I work at the Monroe County ISD, and I was just recently posted to the River Raisin National Battlefield Park. And at that battlefield that happened in the War of 1812, there were probably about 19 different tribes that had sided with the British and attacked the American force here in my hometown, which at the time was called Frenchtown. And one of the things that we have worked on in some summer institutes in creating lesson plans, and 2 years ago, we did something on how the Germans got their ideas for the Jewish cleansing, and they got it from the United States and how they treated Native Americans. So I see uh, that, this thing that happened with Stalin, it makes me wonder too if he didn't get these ideas from some of the Darwinism, survival of the fittest, and viewed that more as an ethnic thing, like Hitler did. Is there any documentation around that at all to demonstrate that idea, or was he just kind of treating Ukraine as an enemy that deserves to be wiped out?
Olenka, you want to tackle that one?
Um, I haven't heard about these connections, but I will look and I will ask our historians, because we are in connection with historians, and I will present for them that pathway. So, and I will be back to you with answer, because mostly what I have heard that like KGB and all these ideas, and that people have to suffer to cleanse an area that mostly was developed in the Tsar Russia and just older, when all these clashes and kingdoms were fighting between each other. And also like when Ukraine was established and when Russia empire was established. It was long history back too. So, and they were using this for cleansing territories on their land also. But I will check your, and I will come back to you.
Thank you, Elena. It just seems so strangely similar, you know, to what the Germans learned from us. They sent scientists to the United States, and when you see these American soldiers and Dwight Eisenhower go into one of these camps and they are just shocked by it, the fact of the matter is they got the idea from us in the way that we exterminated Native Americans and perpetrated genocide against them. And so part of my work at the battlefield is to tell the whole story of all the perspectives that we can at the battlefield, and not to whitewash U.S. history on this. So I'm kind of excited that you mentioned that the U.S. hasn't come out and made a declaration and recognized the Holodomor as a genocide, an attempted genocide uh, against the Ukrainian people. We need to identify that. But I don't know that we've ever identified publicly our connection to the Third Reich and what they did to the victims of the Holocaust. So,
Absolutely. And what strikes me is the way, you talk of how all of these injustices have occurred and from what source they have learned and how they perpetuate this kind of cruelty. It is so important to know what the history is and to learn from it so that you don't repeat it. And we tend to do so many things against humanity throughout the world, and we seem to be quiet about it. It's mind-boggling. We
yeah,
have to be better.
we do. We do.
If I may jump in with one last question, um, as far as some of the rationale that was, I remember you mentioned part of Stalin's reasoning behind why he did this. One of the things that I am familiar with from um, the philosophy that he espoused, that there was an element of, I guess, what you could call determinism, of materialism, that you try to change the circumstance, and then that will, the chemical, the physical, the material interaction will create the new Soviet man, which will then usher in an era of peace and prosperity. And that it sounds like, at least from my understanding of what you said, that he viewed these people in the Ukraine as as a hindrance to that, as people who would be resistant to exactly that program, and for that reasoning. Is there any connection that you know of that exists between that philosophical viewpoint and the rationale behind his actions?
Well, if I understand your question, there has always been a problem for Russia. I'll call it Russia, whether it's the Soviet Union or Russia. But they think of Ukraine as being its little brother, and that Ukraine's history and their history come from the same source, which is a lie in itself, because we come from two different peoples, and our history goes way back, and the Russian history starts in the 15th century with Muscovy. But for some reason, they can't get that through their mind, that we are separate. We have been trying for ages to be a separate nation, but of course, you know, some attempts were not very good, and so we were occupied, and we have been occupied. And now, in our present state, where we finally are supposedly a free nation, we have people that are so still devoted to the Russians that they're not seeing Ukraine as a separate nation.
So it's
So
a new
I
coat
don't
of
know
paint.
whether I've answered your question, but
So it seems like it's a new coat of rationalized paint on a constant belief that
yes,
it's
yes,
just a new rationalization to justify the same thing, the same attempt over many generations.
yes, yes.
Well, thank you. I really
Thank
appreciate
you. Thank
the
you for
answers.
asking those questions.
Certainly.
Thank you so much for everyone. So we will be finishing our lecture. It was great to see everyone here. And please, oh, do we have any more questions? No, I don't see more questions. And I provided my email, so please let me know if I could provide necessary or important information if you need.